Well, we've been working our way through a series, and it's called Dinner with Jesus. Called Dinner with Jesus, and although there was some debate about whether I should change it to Supper with Jesus, because maybe that would be more appropriate, maybe that'd be more accurate for what we want to say. But the idea is still the same, is that, we're going to take the idea, the scenario, that somebody, one of us, maybe somebody we know, could sit down physically at a table like Jesus often did, we see in the Gospels, and talk with him. And how that kind of open conversation might go. And obviously, because we know how we're just naturally curious people, we would probably come up with questions. And so we kind of looked at some of these questions that may come up in these kind of scenarios, and looked at from Scripture how Jesus would answer, and what he might be pointing us to, and the things that we need to hear from him. And we talked about the other week about how we were discussing the idea of forgiveness, and how that's related to our idea of sin. And so we think forgiveness is easy and simple because we think sin is small, and it's manageable, and it's contained. But we actually found out that's not the case at all. And so we talked about that, and then last week we talked about how the question might come on. This is kind of a crossover question. This is kind of somebody who's a cold skeptic, that was just, very hard, might ask, and this might be a kind of question that, a Christian might ask. It could go either way. And the idea has to do with tragedy, because we see these very awful things happen, probably in the news or just something like that we hear about, and they're just awful events. They're tragic to us, and they may shock us because they're so bad. We just weren't prepared for that. And so we see these tragic events, whether at a distance or up close, it may happen to you. There may have been something very tragic that happened in your past. Or it could be somebody close to you. A family member or a friend, and you see these events, and they stir up questions. We wonder about them. How, what are they doing in this world? And we just wonder about the whole idea of these tragic events. They're just so awful to us, and rightfully so. And we looked at how this might be presented to Jesus, and although there's a lot to say in Scripture about this subject, Jesus addresses it in a different kind of way than we might expect. Because what we looked at in the Gospel of Luke is that Jesus talks about two tragic events that happened in the midst of his disciples' life, that happened in their day and age. It would have been front page news. And one of the tragic events had to do with the governor Pilate and how he murdered some Jews on the temple grounds. And then he talked about another event. Now, that event, you obviously know who was involved and who was to blame and all that. You knew Pilate was behind it. There was that event. Then there was another event, a tragic event. Do you remember what it was? Anybody remember?
Isn't that what you're talking about, the tower?
Yeah, the tower. That's right. There was a tower being built, and this is actually part of Jerusalem, and it collapsed. And in the collapse killed like 18 people. And so that was a tragic event. And we don't know what was behind it. We don't know how it happened. We don't know if it was a construction thing. We don't know details. And that's how we come across a lot of events, tragic ones in our lives. We don't know how it happened or why it happened. It just happened. But Jesus points to something very interesting when we encounter these tragic events. We have a tendency to be cold. Yeah, we may be shocked by it a little bit, and we may be put off by it. It may be very awful. But we have a tendency to be judgmental too. We have a tendency to kind of blame the people it happened to, the victims, like they deserved it, like there was something going on that brought it on, that they did themselves. The blame just goes back to them. And we have a tendency to be that way. And Jesus, he basically kind of taken the perspective that, look, this tragic event happened. You can't do anything about it. It's already happened. It's history. You can't undo it. You can't change it. It's just there. But you can change how you respond to it. You can change how you respond to it. Because sometimes, whether it be distant tragedy or it be the ones up close, where we knew that, the person that it happened to, and then we go, well, if they'd been living right, and if they hadn't done that, and if they hadn't been involved in this, and if they hadn't got over there, none of this would have happened. And that gives us an excuse not to be kind to them, not to bless them, not to help them through it, not to show any compassion, because we're blaming. And we've sat back just like the Jews in that age, and we've looked at the circumstance and go, this is a point where God is judging them. You just get what you deserve. You reap what you sow, and all that's that. We have a tendency to be that way. And Jesus pulls us out of that. And kind of just this very direct statement that we need to keep in mind is that blank hinders compassion. Remember what it was? Remember what hinders compassion? Pride. That's right. Our own pride, because it didn't happen to us. Our own pride keeps us from being compassionate. Our own pride keeps us from being compassionate. It hinders our ability to show compassion to others. It hinders our ability. Because it didn't happen to us. And so Jesus, he launches into this discussion that we never expected. Because now, whether we're trying to look at the event and we're asking questions, and even if we knew all the details, even if all the whys were asked and answered, it would just be information. We still have to deal with the tragedy. And Jesus says, you can't change the event, but you can change yourself. You can change your response. And he says, don't think that those Jews that died because of Pilate were any worse than you, that they somehow were sinful and they deserved it, and they just got that. And don't think those Jews that died under that tower, don't think they deserve that. Don't think that's just, what they had coming. Don't think they're worse sinners than you. Be humble. Show compassion. And so he brings us a discussion in a lot different direction than maybe we thought. Today I want to talk about another kind of crossover kind of question that may come from either a Christian or a skeptic, a non-Christian. And it has to do with miracles. It has to do with miracles. Because whether you're a non-Christian, a skeptic, and you're reading through the Bible for the first time, or maybe you've been a believer for a long time, you've read it 10 times. Once you get into the Bible, you recognize this. You're walking into a strange world. The world of the Bible is a strange world. People have names you can't pronounce. And you go, wow, that letter, that name has 16 letters and I don't see many vowels. Right? They got names you can't pronounce. They live in places that you halfway never heard of. They live in places you never heard of. They have names that are strange to you. Their way of life is very different. They live in a time of empires and a time of miracles. And you walk into that strange world of reading the Bible and you go, that's interesting, that's interesting, that's interesting. And you feel like, you're walking into a history. As well you should. And then you get to something miraculous, and you go, okay, really? That's what I'm supposed to believe? I'm just supposed to keep reading like that? That was just a blip, and just kind of go on? That's quite strange, too. And so a skeptic, or maybe somebody who's been a Christian for a while, they run up against these miraculous things they read in the Bible, and that brings them a pause. Kind of like, know about that. But I thought, that everything was going along fine. This was an interesting story. I was following the people and how they lived their lives and this and that. And then all of a sudden, that. And I've never experienced anything like that. I've never seen that. I saw an interview not too long ago with a guy, and he actually claims to be a Christian. He's an actor named Matthew McConaughey. Name sound familiar? You know who I'm talking about, Matthew McConaughey? Yeah. He's been in a lot of movies. You've probably seen maybe one of them at least, because like I say, he's been in a lot. And he's kind of, well known. And he was being interviewed, and he talks about, reading the Bible and different things. And then he talks about miracles. And he says, I read the Bible and I read about this and Jesus teaching that. He says, I read these things. And he says, and then I get to this miracle. He goes, I don't know what to do with it. He's like, I don't know what to make of it. He just doesn't know how that fits into everything. It just becomes a stumbling block to him. And we shouldn't be surprised about that. I mean, if you've ever heard of the Jefferson Bible, does that ever sound familiar? Thomas Jefferson, who was quite the reader, he basically had his own library in his home. Thomas Jefferson, our third president, he went through the Bible and marked out all the miracles. All the miracles. Because he said that the core of it that you need to understand and where you need to find knowledge and, and that kind of wisdom, he says, the miracles just get in the way. And so he marked out it's called the Jefferson Bible. He marked out all the miracles in the Bible. So this is a real thing. And maybe you kind of come across these miracles in the Bible and just kind of scratch your head and go, okay, I don't know what to make of that. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. That's what our focus is going to be on. A question of miracles. That's what our focus is going to be. So if you fill in your bulletin on the back and kind of keep up with these kind of things, that's what our focus is going to be. A question of miracles. A question of miracles. Everybody say that with me. A question of miracles. One more time. A question of miracles. Now, when we get into this subject, it's going to be helpful to divide them up. Old Testament and New Testament. It's going to be helpful to divide them up, and you'll see why in a second. Because here, we're also talking about this. We're talking about BC as opposed to what we may see in AD. Now, the Old Testament, when you think about a miracle in the Old Testament, what comes to mind? Do you have any that you think of when you think about an Old Testament miracle?
Red Sea.
Okay, the Red Sea, parting of the sea. What else? An Old Testament miracle.
The wine in the water was New Testament.
Yeah, that was New Testament.
Getting all those animals on the ark.
Okay. Loading up the ark. What else?
Water into wine. Elisha or Elijah's bones, whichever one it was, and they threw the man in, and he hit the bones, and he came back to life.
Elisha's bone. Yeah. Okay. Any others come to mind about an Old Testament miracle?
Hitting the rock with a staff.
What?
Hitting the rock with a staff to get water.
That's right. Breaking open a rock with a stick, basically, and then getting flowing water for your, for families and families and families that are nearby. Was there another? Mike, you said?
The staff turned into a snake.
Okay.
Parting of the Jordan when the ark went across.
Okay, the parting of the Jordan when the ark went across. Yeah, see, we can sit here and, if we take our time, we can make a nice list because there are plenty that show up. And they're not in every chapter. They're not in every other chapter. But they do pop up and they stand out because because they are miraculous. And they are not something that we encounter in our day and age very often. You know, it's new to us, it's strange to us. But here's the thing. If you try to talk with somebody and prove this happened or explain it happening, anything like that, this is a big problem. Because when you get back before the time of Christ, when you get that far back in history, it's inaccessible. There is a fog. I was a history major, I can tell you. There's a fog over history. As you start going back that far, things get less and less clear. You're just kind of groping around, looking in the dark, trying to find something. And you find something here, and that's it. The Old Testament is really inaccessible to us because of how far back in history it is. That's why it's so hard to understand the way people live and how they made the decisions they made. Because we're talking about, it's so separate from us. And even our best archaeologists and our historians and all of them, even they just have little pieces. I'll give you an example. A few years back, I saw a show on archaeology, and it wasn't based on biblical archaeology, even though it happened in that area, it happened in Syria. And this team of archaeologists were going to excavate, for the first time, this ancient city in Syria. It had never been excavated and worked on by archaeologists, and they brought their team out there, and they were going to do it. Find what they could find and understand what they could understand, and just kind of delve into that. And they knew exactly where it was because they had all these other documents, like people writing and stuff, people talking about, okay, the city was halfway between this place and this place. And the city was at this hillside. And we bought these things from this city. So they had a lot of evidence about the city. Okay? They knew things about it. When they and their team got there and they went through the normal work they did, they found zero evidence that the city ever existed. Zero. And they worked and they looked and they looked and they looked and they worked. And their big team of people and all these professional archaeologists, and they went back over their, evidence that they had to make sure they had the right location. They did all that stuff, and they worked and they came to the conclusion there's zero evidence that this city ever existed. They said, but we know it existed because we have all these other evidence of people writing about it and talking about it, and the work they did there, and the commerce there, and that stuff. But they had zero evidence that the city ever existed. And see, that's what I'm talking about. There's a fog in history. There's been so much time, and cities have been grown up and built and then destroyed again. And places that were there big then are nothing now. There's a fog of history, and this is very inaccessible to us. It just is. But this isn't. Once you get into that time and era, the New Testament is very accessible to us. Now, when you think about a miracle from the New Testament, what do you think of? What comes to mind?
Feeding 5,000.
Okay.
Walking on water.
Okay. Walking on water. What else? Okay.
Changing the water into wine.
Water into wine. You took Miss Eileen. I think she was going to mention that earlier.
Raising the dead.
Raising the dead.
Healing the sick.
Healing the sick. Any others come to mind? A miracle that we see recorded in the New Testament?
Well, I guess you would say freeing of the Israelites.
New Testament. Now we're on the New Testament.
Putting back the ear on, get that cut off.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the soldier's ear was cut off. They even put his name. I mean, that's just an odd little thing the Bible includes. So, we got no problem making a list, too. And like I said, if we spend some time, we could have, quite a long list. of miracles that we recognize being recorded in the New Testament. We can make a nice list of these. Now, when we talk about the New Testament, the miracles all stem from, whether it be him in person or his power, they all stem from Jesus. He's God. And so the miraculous things that we see are basically coming from Jesus. Now, we have 4 Gospels, right, that really teach on Jesus' miracles, that he personally performs, in people's presence. 4 of those. 4 Gospels. And we could say, well, those were written by Jesus' disciples. They were his friends. Are they really people that we can listen to? I mean, would they kind of, tell us things that maybe just because they were such good friends with him? I mean, is that really reliable? Even the Jews who hated Jesus said he did miracles. There's a Jewish document called the Talmud, and it's a writing from Jewish leaders, especially rabbis, and they're documenting things at that time period. And even they say he did so many miracles, he must have been a sorcerer. Even his enemies say he's the source of a lot of miracles. They just don't believe he's God. They believe it's coming from somewhere else. But even his own enemies don't get away from it. Even his own enemies say, okay, he's done so many miracles, he must be a sorcerer. There's something about him. Because they're undeniable. Those miracles happened. Now, in those 4 Gospels, there's 2 miracles that appear in every single Gospel. They get different viewpoints from different people. Mark is not the same as Matthew and all that. But there's 2 that show up in all 4 Gospels. And this is one of them. This is one. It shows up in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, why do you think that is? Why do you think that one, out of all the miracles we talked about, why do you think this one has to be written by all 4 people? Why do you think it ended up that way?
Because there were so many people involved.
Yeah. I mean, that's logical. I mean, you're talking about 5,000 people. And the way they counted people, this is probably a little bit more than 5,000 because they were probably just counting men. 5,000 people saw this happen. And so when Matthew's writing about it, Mark's writing about it, and Luke's writing about it, John's writing about it, they've got tons of witnesses, and they were there themselves. Now think about that. Elberton's about that size? The city of Elberton? Imagine every man and woman witnessing a miracle in Elberton. You go down every street, you turn every corner, every cul-de-sac, everywhere you go in Elberton, every single resident has visually seen a miracle, and they all agree on it. 5,000. And they all said, I was there, I saw it, this is how it happened, this is what happened. 5,000. Zach's exactly right. Of course it would be the one that's going to show up. Now, the other one is that. Shows up in all the Gospels. The resurrection. The resurrection of Christ. Now, get to this, and now Jesus can say, well, I understand your challenge today because I've dealt with that. Turn in your Bibles to the Gospel of John. And Jesus might say, haven't you read John chapter 20. John chapter 20. The Gospel of John chapter 20. Not one of the small letters, the Gospel. And Jesus could say, you know, I've dealt with that question. I understand that question. I understand the doubts. Because he's dealt with that before. Not from a stranger, not from somebody on the edge of his friend group or anything like that. A disciple. Thomas. And Thomas is quite clear about how he feels. Because in verse 25 it says, the other disciples are saying, we have seen the Lord. This is the resurrected Christ. This is after the brutality of the crucifixion. This is after being wrapped up and put in the tomb. But Thomas says to them, unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger, see, he doesn't want to see it. He wants to physically touch. As I put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side. This is a very skeptical man, wouldn't you say? This is a man who's got a lot of doubts. And all his friends, other disciples, are saying, it's here, he's here, he's here. And he's going, unless I examine, I mean, not just see at a distance. Unless I examine it, you're not going to get anything from me. I'm not going along with this. Unless I put my hand into his side, I will not believe it. Verse 26, a week later, Thomas goes a whole week shaking his head. No. A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them, and though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them. And then he says, I need to talk to Thomas. Verse 27. Put your finger here, Thomas. See my hands? Reach out your hand. Put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe. And Thomas said to him, my Lord and my God. And then Jesus said, verse 29, he said, because you have seen me, you have believed. But blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. See, a Christian comes to faith now, and we don't have to have the physical presence of Jesus standing with us for us to believe. And if we did need that, then as soon as he wasn't with us, then we'd have doubts, just like Thomas did. As soon as Jesus was gone, Thomas was like, I can't believe any of this. But we don't, because Jesus says, blessed are you, because you have not seen, and you believe me. And what we see happen here is that this is a doorway. And once you see with the eyes of faith that this is reality, that this happened, that Jesus died and rose from the grave, once you see with the eyes of faith that that actually happened, that it's true, and that involves you because he died for you, once you see with the eyes of faith, you know what's easy to see? A man who can calm a storm. You know what's easy to see? A man who can turn water into wine. You know what's easy to see? A man who can walk on water. Because he walked through death, and he said he would. And he came back from it. A man brutalized. He didn't just fall asleep and die in his sleep. The man was brutalized. He He was unrecognizable. He was so beaten and torn. And he went through, and he comes back. And then he's standing before Thomas. Thomas, come. You wanted to see, here you are. And when you see with the eyes of faith, those other miracles are not a problem for you. Because you know the source. And so you can see a man who turns water into wine, and you can agree with Christ, because Christ affirms the miracles of the Old Testament. Christ never contradicts them. You see Christ as someone who affirms the stories from the Old Testament. And so, you don't have to go and try and divide up 25, 30 miracles and say, well, how do we prove this, and when did this happen, and who saw it, and all this. You don't have to go into all that. Because you see the eyes of faith in this, and when this man says it's true, you take his word for it. You take his word for it. As the music plays this morning, before we go into communion, I want to remind you that you serve a God of miracles. His hand is not too short that he can't reach, as the Bible says. You serve a God of miracles. That's who you're praying to.